We're very excited tonight to have Nathaniel Stinnett from the Environmental Voter Project talking to us about where environmental voters can make the biggest difference in 2021 and 2022. I'm particularly excited about this because this is not the first time that Nathaniel's spoken to us. In 2018, he did a national call for us, which is my introduction to the Environmental Voter Project, which has been something that has been a very fulfilling and useful volunteer experience for me in the years since then. And I hope to really continue. But just to give you a little bit more background, Nathaniel Stinnett founded the Environmental Voter Project in 2015. And at that point, he had over a decade of experience as a senior advisor, a consultant, and a trainer for political campaigns and issue advocacy nonprofits. He's been called a visionary by the New York Times and a voting guru by Grist Magazine. He's a frequent expert speaker on cutting-edge campaign techniques, the behavioral science behind getting people to vote. He's held a variety of senior leadership and campaign management positions on the US Senate, the congressional, state, and mayoral campaigns, and sit on the board of advisors for MIT's Environmental Solutions Initiative. He's formerly been a practicing attorney at the international law firm of Dale & Piper, LLP, has his bachelor's from Yale and a JD from Boston College Law School, and lives in Boston with his wife and 2 children. And we're very excited to see what he can tell us tonight about what's happening in 2021 and coming up in 2022. So Nathaniel, take it away, please.
Great. Thank you so much, Frances. And thank you, Jen and Mark and Marianne and everybody involved with Elders Climate Action. I just have such a special place in my heart for ECA. Almost since the beginning of our work at the Environmental Voter Project, we've worked closely with people from ECA, and we just love you guys. We absolutely love you. And so tonight's gonna be fun. I look forward to making a presentation and then having a Q&A session afterwards. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A, and we will hopefully get to them during that Q&A session afterwards. I do just want to beg your indulgence on one item, and that is there are many of you who are attending who know about our work at the Environmental Voter Project, but there are also many of you who are attending who don't know about our work at the Environmental Voter Project. And so what I'm going to do is try to split the difference. I'm going to give you a little glimpse into what we do at the Environmental Voter Project, why and how, but not go into enormous detail because there are some of you who already know all the detail. But certainly part of the reason we have the Q&A session afterwards is if there are any details that you really want to drill down on, you can. What I will also get to in the second part of the presentation is what Frances mentioned as the title and focus of this presentation, and that is where in particular, both in next year's midterms, but also in this fall's local and state elections, there are particularly impactful opportunities for environmental voters to make a difference. Because when we're talking about turning out environmental voters, we obviously want our efforts to make a difference. And we've got some really interesting data on that. So without further ado, let's go right ahead. I'm going to share my screen here. And all right. Hopefully that's it. So this is what I just went over. We're going to do a quick reminder of EVP's work, go over high leverage states in 2022, high leverage opportunities this fall, and then a Q&A session. So let's start with just a little introduction to this nonprofit that I run, the Environmental Voter Project. Put as simply as possible, we really just do 2 things. The first is we identify environmentalists who don't vote. And then 2, we turn them into better voters. That's it. We find environmentalists who don't vote, and then we turn them into better voters. And so that also means we don't do a lot of the stuff that your typical environmental nonprofit does focus on. For instance, we don't endorse candidates. We don't lobby for particular policies. As odd as it might sound, we don't even try to persuade people to care more about climate or environmental issues. A good way to think of us is we're not even in the mind-changing business. Instead, we are in the behavior-changing business. What we do is we identify people who don't need their minds changed. They're already with us. They're dyed-in-the-wool super environmentalists. They're just not voting. They need a behavioral intervention. And that's where we step in. We identify these people, and then we message to them with the latest behavioral science. And we text and we call and we canvass and we send mail and we send digital ads, working with a lot of volunteers, many of whom are in this meeting right now, to turn these people into better voters. So I'm going to briefly, as I said, go through why we do this and how we do this. And then I'll get into the meat of the discussion, which is where are there some particularly high leverage opportunities for work like this over the next 13 months. So why do we do this at the Environmental Voter Project? Well, one of the biggest reasons is this. One of the biggest reasons we don't get consistently good environmental leadership at the federal level, but also at the state and local level, is simply that there aren't enough voters who care deeply about climate and the environment. Now, I want to be clear, because I'm sure lots of you have seen polls that say, oh, well, 60% of Americans, 70% of Americans support government action on climate change. Yes, they do, and those polls aren't wrong. But there's a big difference between supporting something and prioritizing it. Because politicians can't just do whatever they want, and they sure as hell can't just do whatever voters want. And so they care a lot more about voter priorities than they do about preferences. And even though there are a lot of Americans who would prefer government action on climate change, who would prefer government action protecting the environment, there are far fewer that prioritize it. This poll that you're looking at right here is a poll of people who voted in the 2020 presidential general, so the highest of high turnout. Only 14% listed climate change or the environment in their top 3 priorities. When we drill down to the top 1, well, presidential general election voters, we're lucky if you get 4 or 5% listed as their number 1 priority. And that's a big problem. It's a big, big problem with limited time and limited money, and politicians, even if they win, only being able to spend their political capital on a few things. Well, why on earth would they spend it on something that only 4 or 5% of voters list as their top priority? Whereas, oddly enough, you might see like Second Amendment and gun issues down at the bottom. When you drill down on the top priority there, it's 7%. This makes a huge difference in how policy is made. Politicians like to win elections, so they pay attention to what voter priorities are, not preferences. This is a really, really big issue. It's a really big problem. And it gets to the heart of why we started the Environmental Voter Project 5 years ago. I was running a lot of campaigns, big and small, some of which Frances alluded to in her introduction. And I was deeply frustrated by looking at poll after poll after poll like this. When you're running a campaign and all you care about is getting more votes than your opponents on a Tuesday in November, you can't spend all your time and money talking about the stuff that voters don't care about. You just can't. And I know that sounds cynical, but you need to win in order to do stuff. And honestly, I didn't think there was a way out of the conundrum until I started to realize, by sifting through a lot of different polling data and a lot of predictive models, and I'll get into what predictive modeling is a little bit later, I realized the reason so few voters care deeply about climate and the environment is not actually because too few Americans do. When you look at all Americans, there are tens of millions of them who care deeply about climate and the environment. So Why aren't those numbers showing up in polls of actual voters or polls of likely voters? Well, it was for one very good reason. We realized that environmentalists just aren't voting. We realized as we sifted through more and more polling data, and this still holds true to this day, by the way, that the environmental movement isn't losing the persuasion game. We're losing the turnout game. We are winning the hearts and minds of millions of people. There are more people who care deeply about climate and the environment than there are NRA members. We have lots of potential power in the environmental movement. It's just that we're not showing up on election day. And just to give you a sense of what I mean by these numbers, in the 2016 presidential election, 10.1 million environmentalists didn't vote. And I want to be clear what we mean by this data. All of these people are already registered. They're registered, they just didn't show up. 12.4 million in the 2018 midterms, 8.1 million in the most recent presidential general, the highest turnout election in American history. And 8.1 million dyed-in-the-wool super environmentalists who are already registered to vote stayed at home. Now, I know this is frustrating for some people, but I want to suggest to you that this is an enormous opportunity. It is a huge opportunity because we live in a moment in time where it's almost impossible to change people's minds or opinions about anything, especially climate change. But to find people who don't need their minds changed, to find people who care so deeply about this stuff that it's their #1 priority, and they just need their behavior changed, they need to go from not voting to starting to vote. Well, I won't claim that's easy. Of course it's not easy, but it's a heck of a lot easier than changing minds. It's a heck of a lot easier than turning climate deniers into people who care deeply about this stuff. So this is why we focus on this work at the Environmental Voter Project. And very, very briefly, I'm going to go through the 3 steps that we take on identifying and then mobilizing these environmentalists and then turning them into habitual voters. And again, please forgive me if I don't drill down into really, really deep detail here, but that's why we have the Q&A, and I'm also mindful of the fact that although some of you are new to the Environmental Voter Project, some of you aren't, and I'm trying to keep both your interests here. So what is this 3-step process? First, identification. We use data analytics and predictive modeling to individually identify people who list climate or the environment as their #1 priority. Okay, now what do I mean by that? Very briefly, we poll tens of thousands of people per state. These are huge, huge surveys. Your typical political poll will be of like 400 to 600 people. We poll 10 to 15,000 per state. We ask them one simple question: what's your #1 most important political priority? Then we're able to work with data scientists to isolate the people who listed climate change or some other environmental issue as that #1 priority. So let's say we're in Arizona and we poll 10,000 people and 1,000 of them list climate or some other environmental issue as their top priority. Well, then it's actually pretty easy for data scientists to say, okay, what do we know about these 1,000 people? These people who have just told us that climate and the environment isn't just important to them, it is the single most important issue to them. What data do we have about them in the public voter files? What census data do we have about them? What other publicly available data is there out there? We only use publicly available data, but there's a lot of that data out there. And what these data scientists are able to do is build very, very rich, accurate profiles of not only who these 1,000 people are, but where are the other people in Arizona who might be like them? And it's a long iterative process, but at the end of it, what we're able to do is take a public voter file, like the one in Arizona, and assign a score to every single voter in the state from 0 to 100, telling us how likely they are to not just care about climate or the environment, but list it as their #1 priority. And I know this sounds really complicated and convoluted, but it's important to understand two things. One, this is actually how all sophisticated political campaigns target voters now. They don't target by demographic group. Nobody does that anymore. Gone are the days of targeting soccer moms or NASCAR dads. No, political campaigns have scored every single one of you. And I know that sounds creepy because it is a little creepy, but this is how political campaigns target people, and it can be extraordinarily accurate. Then the second thing I'll say is there's an analogy that might be helpful to many of you. I imagine many of you, like I, have purchased life insurance before. And if you think about this process, what do you do when you purchase life insurance? Well, the first thing you do is you tell them a lot about yourself, right? Say, this is how old I am, this is my medical history, this is how much I drink, this is how much I smoke, this is how much I exercise. No, I don't dive out of airplanes. Like you're giving them all this information that allows them to build a risk profile for you. And not just like a slapdash, casual, maybe kind of accurate profile. They're taking this information and they're trying to compare you to millions of other people and build a predictive model. Now, they don't call it that. They call it an actuarial table, and it's slightly different, but only slightly. What they're trying to do is build a predictive model just like we do. They're trying to predict how expensive this policy is going to be. They're trying to predict how sick you'll be and how long you're going to live. And if they're not accurate, the entire global economy crashes. Well, we do the same thing, only we're not trying to build an actuarial table for every voter in the state of Arizona. We're just trying to figure out who are the people who have really, really high likelihoods of listing climate or the environment as their #1 priority. I'm happy to go into more detail on this identification part in the Q&A, but that's sort of the basic overview of how we do this. Second, once we identify these people, once we know that we have found people who have at least like an 80 or 85% likelihood of listing climate or the environment as their #1 priority over all others, well, then it's very easy to only focus on the ones who aren't good at voting, because that is public record. You don't need a data scientist to help you with that. You can all go to your town and city hall and look up which of your neighbors vote and which of them don't. It is public record. So then what we're able to do is the second part, mobilization. We're then able to leverage the latest behavioral science and use completely apolitical, agnostic messaging to just do one thing, and that is turn these people into better voters. We don't even need to talk about climate or the environment if that's not what works. Because remember, we're only targeting people who, like, if you shake them awake at night, they're going to scream climate change. So our messaging can be whatever we want. We could talk about chocolate chip cookies if that's what works best. We can use peer pressure. We can tell people, oh, 84% of your neighbors are voting. Whatever messaging works, because we already know these people are with us. They don't need their minds changed. They don't need education. They just need their behavior changed. And then the final step is habit reinforcement. Our goal at the Environmental Voter Project is not to win one-off elections. Believe me, talking to infrequent voters is not a very efficient way to win one election. But that's not our goal. What our goal is to change that polling data that you saw at the beginning. Because politicians don't care about the priorities of non-voters. They just don't. And I know that sounds cynical, but it's literally public record whether you vote or not. The first thing any campaign does is they open up their laptop and they look at public voter files and they say, okay, we're trying to win a gubernatorial campaign. How many people in this state vote in gubernatorial elections? And you better believe they don't spend all their time and money talking to and polling and persuading the people who never vote in this election. And so the reason we focus on this habit reinforcement is we want to build the good voting habits for these environmental voters. And so we work year-round in every election to turn these non-voters into super voters. So very quickly, what does this look like? Well, after building these predictive models and assigning these scores on voter files, we are literally able to see on an individualized basis by name and street address who the 42,067 super environmentalists in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania are, who are registered to vote and list climate and the environment as their #1 priority, or rather have a very high likelihood of listing it as their #1 priority, yet have never voted in a single election before. There are almost 70,000 Philadelphians who have never voted in a midterm before. You better believe Pennsylvania is going to be an important state next year. We literally know them by name and street address. We have phone numbers for most of them. Then what we're able to do, as I mentioned before, is just deliver the messaging that we know has the highest likelihood of increasing their turnout. And so we run hundreds of randomized control trials. These are behavioral science experiments, just testing which messages work best with which subgroups of these non-voting environmentalists to turn them into better voters. We canvass, we call, we text, we send digital ads, we send direct mail. And then finally, as I mentioned before, we work year-round. Just as an example, in 2020, we did not keep our powder dry and only talk to people during the presidential general. That's not because the general was unimportant. Of course, the general election was important. But sometimes the cheapest, easiest way to make a new voter in November is actually to talk to them when they have an election in January or February. There's a lot less static. It's a lot more likely they'll pick up their phones. And once you set your time horizon to trying to change people's long-term voting habits, well, then every election becomes a precious behavioral intervention opportunity. It becomes a precious opportunity to talk to these people and try to change their behavior, which, if you think about it, is how you change any type of behavior, right? I mean, if you're trying to exercise more often, your physical therapist or your trainer isn't going to say, oh, okay, just come and see me every 2 years when there's a big federal election and we'll get you in shape. No, they want to see you all the time. And it's the same thing with us. We want to use every election as an intervention opportunity. And so we made a ton of voter contacts in 2020. We had great results. I'm not going to get into a lot of the results because this isn't about the Environmental Voter Project too much tonight. But in our randomized control trials, we were able to prove that we were solely responsible for increasing turnout 1.8 percentage points in Pennsylvania over our control group for the presidential general. Let me say that again. While controlling for all outside variables, like the $14 billion that were spent by presidential campaigns and super PACs, we were able to control for all that and isolate what our sole impact was. And it wasn't 1.8 percentage points across the entire state. We're not talking to every Pennsylvanian. We're only talking to the environmentalists who are unlikely to vote. But that's still a pretty darn big jump in turnout for a small organization like us. We boosted turnout 0.6 percentage points in Florida. We boosted it 0.9 percentage points in the Georgia US Senate runoffs. But as happy as we are with this, we are even more proud of this. As I told you, we are not some secret election winning organization. Our goal is long-term growth of the electorate. And just since we have started in 2016, in these 12 states, we're now in 17 states, but in the 12 states you're looking at here, 730,000 of the almost 7.4 million voters we've contacted are now voting so consistently that they voted in their most recent federal, state, and even local election. These people, I mean, we wouldn't be talking to them if they weren't awful voters. And now they are so good that if you're running for dog catcher, you're going to say, I'm going to talk to this person. I'm going to poll them to figure out what issues they care about. These are now first-class citizens driving policymaking, not just at the federal level, but the state and local level. All right, we have many wonderful volunteers on this call. We love working with volunteers. We love working with many people from ECA. You can even see a quote here from a lovely woman named Jennifer in Arizona, whom we all really love at the Environmental Voter Project. But we are enormously grateful at how serious all of our volunteers take this work. They understand that we are only giving them opportunities to contact voters if we have found, sifting through our own experiments and other evidence, that it is worth their time, that it will have an impact. I particularly love this quote from a woman named Cheryl in California, talking about all the campaigns that she had been on. And she said, from a volunteer standpoint, EVP has hands down the best voter data set that I and my colleagues have experienced. Is every single person we ask our volunteers to contact the perfect right person? No, no. We're working with probability models just like everybody else is. But I don't think anybody's better than us. I know we're not perfect, but we've got really, really good data and really, really good messaging. We're now working in 17 states. If you're curious in the Q&A, I can go over why we work in these states as opposed to other states. But what I would really love to do is get into the second part of this presentation, and that is, as we all think, not just about this fall, but next year, a very important midterm election year, what are some states where not just environmental voters, but in particular, these environmental non-voters that I've been talking about, these people who are already with us, they're just sitting on the sidelines, they're like potential energy. Where could they make the most difference? Well, first, let me show you this. As of today, and obviously everything can change, as of today, the Cook Political Report lists the states that you're looking at here as competitive US Senate or gubernatorial elections in 2022. Now, I'm sure we could all quibble with some of these, like, should New York be listed? Should South Carolina be listed? Maybe Massachusetts should be in there, even though it isn't. I don't know, we can all quibble with this. It'll probably change a lot over the next 13 months. But if we forget about state legislative races, if we forget about congressional races, and those are two big things that I just said to hold aside, if we just focus on gubernatorial and US Senate races, you'll see those yellow states have competitive or are likely to have competitive US Senate races. The light green ones have competitive gubernatorials, and the dark green ones have both a competitive US Senate and a competitive gubernatorial. Now, again, I want to acknowledge that I am leaving to the side a bunch of extraordinarily important things, state legislative races, local elections like mayorals, and hundreds and hundreds of completely redrawn congressional maps and districts. And I get that, but that's a much more complicated map. Okay, so what's the overlay of those low propensity environmental voters on this map that I just showed you? Where among these states could those non-voting environmentalists, or at least environmentalists who have never voted in a midterm, make the most impact? Well, that's what you see here. All of the states that are in green, whether they have that cross-hatching or not, are states where there is a gubernatorial or a Senate race or both, where there also happen to be disproportionately large populations of non-voting environmentalists. Disproportionately large. These are the states where those non-voting environmentalists, those environmentalists who typically skip midterm elections, they could make a really, really big difference. And again, remember, you're only looking at states that the Cook Political Report as of today says, these are going to be competitive, at least gubernatorial or US Senate. And those hash marked states, well, those are states where low propensity environmental voters, if they vote, could make a huge difference. And there is both a competitive gubernatorial and a competitive US Senate race. Now, again, I want to go back to that last map. There are other states that are enormously important, right? No one's going to deny the political importance of a place like Ohio or Wisconsin. God knows Wisconsin is politically important. But there actually aren't that many low propensity environmental voters in Wisconsin. These environmentalists who skip midterms, they don't carry tons of potential power in a place like Wisconsin. So I would never tell you, oh, don't worry about Wisconsin. Don't care about it. It's not worth your energy. No, Wisconsin is totally worth your energy. But when it comes to places where these low propensity environmental voters could have the biggest impact, that's this map you're looking at here. And in particular, Nevada, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Florida, at least the way things look now, and a lot can change over 13 months. These are states where these low propensity environmental voters are going to pack a lot of potential power. They won't have power if they don't vote. But if they do vote, they can make a huge difference. And here are some of the raw numbers. What you're looking at here in just some of those states that I mentioned is people who we at the Environmental Voter Project have already identified as having an extraordinarily high likelihood of listing climate or the environment as their number one priority over all others. So these are super environmentalists who are registered to vote, but they've never voted in a single midterm election ever. 307,000 of them in Arizona, 794,000 in Florida, a state where like it's hard to have any election without it being decided by only like 30 or 40,000 votes. 139,000 in Nevada. Nevada is not a big state. 139,000 is a huge number. 871,000 in Pennsylvania. Take it from someone who grew up in Pennsylvania. That's like everything. And they're already registered to vote. And they're already with us. They just need these behavioral science informed interventions to try to get them to the polls. All right, well, what does this mean for this fall? Well, this fall, I want you to think about two things. One, there are a whole bunch of elections that are important in and of themselves, right? I'm not a policy guy, I'm a political guy, but I know enough about policy to understand that actually local and state policymakers have a lot of leverage on climate and environmental policy. It's not just a federal game. Big city mayors can save the planet. State legislators and governors can save the planet. And so a lot of the elections I'm about to talk to you about are important in and of themselves, but they're also important because of what I just told you about in the midterms. So these are the states that I just mentioned to you. These are the states that just had all this data back here, right? Well, it turns out all of them have elections this fall. And so if you think that a year from now, you're going to be a little bit concerned about voter turnout in Arizona, well, the upcoming Tucson municipal election is a big opportunity for you. Because voting is not a series of one-off transactions. It's a potentially habitual behavior, just like most behavior, just like exercising or eating healthy or anything. And so it turns out that one of the best ways to make a new environmental voter in next year's midterms is to talk to them now, is to use the Tucson municipal election as an opportunity to talk to them. Or in Florida, use the 20th congressional district election or the Miami election. Or in Georgia, the open Atlanta mayoral election. Heck, Pennsylvania and Texas have statewide elections this fall. Every single voter in Pennsylvania and Texas has an election on November 2nd. Every single one of them. Now, are these enormously important elections? No. Are they enormously important for environmental policy making? No. Are they enormously important for changing the behavior of all of these non-voters? Yeah, you better believe it. If the first time we talk to one of these non-voters is next fall, our conversion cost is going to be somewhere around 75 or 80 bucks. So that means it'll cost about 75 or 80 bucks to make a new voter. If instead we get to talk to them now, when there's far less static about an election they might not even know about, man, sometimes it takes us as little as 15 or 20 bucks to turn a non-voter into a voter. It's such a special opportunity. And then I know that I don't need to tell many of you, we were talking about it right before this call, that Virginia has a statewide election this fall. They're voting for governor, they're voting for their other statewide constitutional officers, and their entire state legislature. All right, I'm going to get to the Q&A. As I think many of you know, the Environmental Voter Project loves working with Elders Climate Action. And ECA is co-hosting some phone banks with us on Friday, October 29th, Monday, November 1st, and Tuesday, November 2nd. We will be using this behavioral science-informed messaging to call the voters we have identified as caring deeply about climate and the environment, yet they are unlikely to vote in this fall's elections. We'll be calling Virginia for their statewide election. We'll be calling into Arizona and North Carolina and Georgia and New Mexico. And again, as I mentioned, these elections are important in and of themselves. The next mayor of Atlanta and the next governor of Virginia have serious policymaking power when it comes to climate and the environment. But even beyond that, boy, is this a great way to start making a down payment on 2022. If we get someone to vote in a sleepy off-year election, it only takes 2 months for the record of them having voted to show up on public voter files. And then anybody who is running for Congress or Senate or governor next year says, holy moly, if Jen voted in that Tucson municipal election, she's definitely going to vote in the Arizona gubernatorial or US Senate election. We got to go after her now. We got to poll her to figure out what issues she cares about. This is how environmental voters start moving policymaking. So I hope you will join us. I hope it has been interesting learning a little bit about our work or refreshing yourselves a little bit about the Environmental Voter Project's work. And most importantly, starting to get a feel for what the lay of the electoral land is over the next 13 months. And in particular, the enormous potential political power in the environmental movement. And the opportunity that all of you have to turn that potential power into actual power. I am really looking forward to this Q&A. Oh my gosh, and look at that. Perfect timing, 7:40. Oh, that never happens. Okay, I'm really excited for the Q&A.
That was great. Thank you so much. And if you have questions for Nathaniel you haven't put in the Q&A yet, please put them in there. Some of the folks are just like me, 3 years ago, really surprised that there are people who care deeply about the environment who don't vote. And they're wondering, like, who are these people? What's going on with them?
Yeah. Well, great question. I can answer the first part. The second part, I have a little bit less data on. So the first part, who are these people? Well, they might not be who you expect. They're not me. By and large, whatever the typical stereotype of an environmentalist was, even as recently as 15 or 20 years ago, no longer holds true. These are not predominantly white yuppies driving around in electric vehicles wearing Patagonia, stuff like that. Instead, and this isn't just our own research, this is also research that Pew has found, and Yale Program on Climate Change Communications finds this as well. When you're drilling down on these people who list climate or the environment as their #1 priority, they are more likely to be Black or Latino or Asian American than white. They are more likely to make less than $50,000 a year than more. And yes, they're more likely to be young than old, but that hides a lot of interesting nuance. And even that trope about like young people care about the environment, other people don't, really doesn't hold true any longer. And maybe this audience I'm talking to now isn't as surprised by that, but what we are now consistently seeing in our data is 18 to 24-year-olds have a significantly large number of people who care deeply about climate and the environment. 25 to 34, it's even higher. And then it's like the sine wave starts going down into a dip again. And from about 35 until all the way to your mid 60s, that's when it's at sort of the nadir of age groups who care deeply about climate and the environment. But then in the mid 60s, it starts going up again, especially among women. What we consistently see in all of our data is a gender gap that grows with age. So if you look at any age group, women are always going to be more likely than men to list climate or the environment as their top priority. But the older you get, the wider that gender gap grows, such that when you're looking at people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, sometimes women are 30% more likely than men to list climate or the environment as their top priority. So that's the answer to the first part of the question. Who are these people? Second part, why aren't they voting? That's a little bit harder to answer. We try to take a very scientifically rigorous approach to everything we do at the Environmental Voter Project. And we have a lot of hints and clues as to why these environmentalists aren't voting, but no good hard evidence. And this is why. Any social science, whether it be economics or sociology or psychology or political science, any social science is pretty good at measuring how to get someone to take an action. That's what social scientists are good at. What they're not good at is the opposite. What they're not good at is, why aren't these people taking this action? Why aren't they doing what we want them to do? Really, the only way you can measure that is to ask them. And when you poll people about why they don't do something that society views as important, they lie their pants off. And we know that because remember what I've now said a few times, whether you vote or not is public record. We know, and you can go to our website, environmentalvoter.org, to the results tab, and you can see some of the research that we've done at the bottom. And there's a study called like, why do so many people lie about voting? Or it's called something like that. We've done a lot of research on it, and it's really hard to figure out why people don't vote, because time and time again, it's been proven that all they do is they tell you what they think the palatable answer is. So that's a very long way of me saying, we don't know why they're not voting. What we do know is the following two things. One, I already told you, these environmentalists are more likely to be people of color, young, and poor. What do those three people have in common? Those three types of people? They vote less often. They vote less often than the average American. So one thing that's going on is just a pure demographic correlation. The second thing is the environmental movement for decades, even generations, has been inherently apolitical. For 30, 40, 50 years, when environmentalists have thought about how to have an impact, it's change what we eat, change the electricity we consume, change how we get to work, give a hoot, don't pollute, recycle, stuff like this, all of which is important, but it's inherently apolitical. I mean, would you ever hear someone who cares about gun control or reproductive rights never mention political engagement? Well, that's what we've had to deal with in the environmental movement. And I think that's another reason why there's this turnout issue.
Also had some people asking about the effects of voter suppression, other efforts to undermine our democracy. I was wondering what you're thinking about that.
Yeah, very, very good question. And it is something that people in the environmental movement are either unaware of or not doing enough about. Because remember what I just told you about who these people are who list climate or the environment as their top priority. They are more likely to be people of color than white. They're more likely to be poor than wealthy, and they're more likely to be young than old. Wherever you are, if there is a government entity that is trying to make it harder to vote, I guarantee you they are targeting one of those three groups I just mentioned: people of color, poor people, or young people. And so what that means to us in the environmental movement is that whether these government entities are knowingly targeting environmentalists doesn't matter. All that matters is they de facto are making it harder for environmentalists to vote. Pretty much any voter suppression effort is going to take away political power from people of color, young people, and poor people. And that is the core of the modern environmental movement. And so, yes, ballot access and voting rights are essential to the environmental movement's political power, essential to it. As far as what we're doing at the Environmental Voter Project, well, we're not a litigation shop. We're not lawyers, and there are great groups like the ACLU and the Brennan Center for Justice and the NAACP and the Southern Poverty Law Center who do focus on these things. We don't do that litigation work, and we're also not an advocacy shop. But what we do is we work year round, not just in the big fancy elections, but year round, deepening those grooves around voting so that people understand what they need to do to vote. So it's not a surprise once every 2 years. We help them sign up for vote by mail. We help them understand when they can vote early. And we don't just wait for the big elections to teach them that. We're making sure that even when they've got a library trustee election, they know how to vote early. So that's how we're trying to address this. But the legal work and the advocacy work is enormously important too.
And you mentioned the various ways that EVP reaches out to voters and talked about phone banking, which many of us have been involved in. But would you say a little bit more about how you reach out to voters?
Yeah, so until the day after tomorrow, at which point some things are going to change, and I'm happy to explain that. We're contacting people in 5 different ways. So that's phone calls, door-to-door canvassing, text messages, direct mail, and digital advertisements. So those first 3 I mentioned are done by volunteers. So phone calls, text messages, and door-to-door canvassing. The last 2, direct mail and digital ads, we just do internally, and we work with vendors, and that's what we spend a lot of our money on. And in all of those instances, we use this behavioral science informed messaging. So if you're a volunteer signing up for a phone bank, you will get trained on Zoom. We will teach you how to use the equipment. You will have a script to read from, and the script will be very easy. It'll be completely nonpartisan. And we know that you are, have a very, very high likelihood of having each person be someone who cares deeply about climate and the environment, but they're not a good voter. So those are the 5 ways that we contact people. Now, what happens in a few days? Well, it's a very long story to tell, but the mobile phone carriers are imposing new rules in a few days, which change how you can contact voters. And essentially, up until now, you had to offer the option of voters to opt out, which we had done. Starting on October 1st, you cannot contact any voter unless they have previously opted in. And you don't need to be a genius to understand if you text millions of voters and say, hey, will you opt in to getting text messages from me? Not that many will sign up. So this may change. A lot is fluid, but in about 2 or 3 days, we are going to pause texting and just do those 4 things: door-to-door canvassing, phone calls, direct mail, and digital ads. I just do want to mention one more thing, though, and that is after November 2nd, we're going to launch an experiment testing the impact on voter turnout with volunteer postcards. We know that volunteer postcards are very popular with people. They've been asking us about them for 2 years. To be totally honest, we've always said no, because we don't want to ask our volunteers to do anything that we don't have proof of actually working. And up until recently, every randomized control trial we had seen did not show that there was a statistically significant increase in turnout based on these volunteer postcards. Whereas our phone calls did have a statistically significant impact. Our texts and our canvassing and our mail and digital ads, but that's starting to change. And so after November 2nd, we're going to start running some experiments with volunteer postcards too.
Got to buy more postcard stamps. See if there's anything that we missed. Someone's asking if the website shows typical messaging that EVP employs.
Yeah, so the website, some of the reports and studies on our research tab show some of the messaging that we test, but a lot of the messaging isn't on the website. So let me tell you about some of our messaging. I am a behavioral science nerd. I spend a lot of time, at least once a month, lecturing on some aspect of behavioral science, usually in academic environments, but also to other voter turnout organizations. And so I could talk about this forever, but I'm mindful of the fact that we don't have much more time, and I know that we need to brief you about the next wonderful meetings and things like that, so I'll be quick. What we have found, and what the latest generation of behavioral scientists have found, is that what does not work is trying to rationally convince people of the importance of voting. Never works. And so what we don't do is call these people and say, hey, you care about climate change, or we think you care about climate change. You need to vote in this election because it's important for climate change and blah, blah, blah. Even though that sounds completely rational and completely logical. But study after study after study, randomized control trial after randomized control trial has proven that that not only doesn't increase turnout one iota, sometimes it even depresses turnout. Instead, what the latest generation of behavioral economists and behavioral psychologists have found is that if you want to change someone's behavior, if you want to get them to buy your beer or your sneaker or exercise more often or eat healthier or vote, what you should not do is talk to them as a rational being. Instead, you should talk to them as a social being. And so what we do with the Environmental Voter Project is we try to figure out not only who are these people, but who do they want to be? What societal norms do they buy into? And so what the types of messaging we use at the Environmental Voter Project is we essentially try to figure out what norm do these people buy into and how can we leverage that to change their behavior. So let me give you some examples. We will text people and say, hey, did you know last time there was an election, Mark, 422 people on your block of Main Street turned out to vote? Just like pure peer pressure, juvenile stuff that you would have heard on like the playground growing up. Or when you call people on a phone. On the phone, you simply say, we hear turnout's going to be high in Tucson and the election's on Tuesday. We know it's important for you to be a consistent voter. Will you be voting by mail or in person? Essentially framing it so that people have to say back to you, oh, no, it's not important to me to be a consistent voter. And if we say turnout is going to be high, it lends this like patent of peer pressure to it that people think like, oh my gosh, everybody's voting. We've got to vote. So that's the type of stuff that we use. We also, just a third technique is we get people to promise to vote. And that sounds simple, but it's deceptively so. If you get someone to promise to take an action, it's like a trap closing on them, because then you can follow up with them right before the election and remind them of the promise they made. You can say, hey, Francis, on September 28th, you made a promise to vote. The election's on Tuesday, and we know it's important to you to keep your promises. Your polling place is around the corner at 123 Main Street, and we know that you'll follow through on your pledge to be a good voter. These are the types of behavioral science tools that we use, and we know that they work. I'm 1 minute over. I want to stop. I know we need to tell you about the awesome guests you have next month and all of that, but thank you for inviting me. And please, please, please do join us at these phone banks.
Thank you so much. That was a terrific presentation, and we look forward to working more with you. And I hope a number of ECA members who haven't volunteered before will find things they want to do with EVP. And Nathaniel's right, we have some other great things coming up for our national call on October 26th. We've got Tempting Your Taste Buds. It'll be a little bit different from some of our other national calls, a little bit more fun, getting ready for the holidays, but not just fun and games. It's very important for climate change because our speaker, Heather Kolakowski from Cornell, is an expert on how to make plant-rich diets appealing and to make them delicious. So if you've read Project Drawdown work, you know that plant-rich diets are an extremely important climate solution, but they have the disadvantage of many people think, ooh, broccoli or whatever your least favorite vegetable was. People don't realize how delicious those things can be. So Heather is going to be here to tell us how to enjoy improving the climate, which is something we don't get to do every day. Also related to Project Drawdown, on November 9th, our parent organization, Elders Action Network, is having a special presentation at noon Eastern Time by Paul Hawken, who was one of the creators of Project Drawdown. Has a new book out, Regeneration, Ending the Climate Crisis in One Generation. This is going to be a little different for your average webinar. This is going to be a conversation between Paul Hawken and 4 elder activists, including our national co-chair, Leslie Wharton. So it'll be a chance to really explore what can we do that can make a huge difference in climate change in a short period of time, and doing it in creative ways and ways that most of them maybe haven't tried before, haven't heard about. So really looking forward to both those presentations, and I hope you'll join us for that. And I hope you will join us in more work with the Environmental Voter Project. So thank you. And Jen, did I leave anything out?
I don't think so. I think you covered it all. Make sure to sign up for the Elders Promote the Vote project, and we'll make sure that you get information about signing up for those phone banks that Nathaniel was talking about, and any other upcoming events from EVP. So make sure you sign up, and we'll get you all that information. And other than that, I think have a wonderful evening. Thank you everyone for joining us. And thank you, Nathaniel, for all of the work that EVP is doing and for being such an awesome partner for Elders Climate Action.
Thank you. We love Elders Climate Action.